There's a world beyond New York when it comes to theater, and there are tours, both large and small, musicals and plays, proving that there are audiences all around the country eager for great shows. Hello, I'm Gordon Cox from Variety, and joining me today to share their insight into the world of national tours are Meredith Blair, president of the booking group, Mike Isaacson, producer of Fox Theatricals, Colleen Jennings-Roggensack, executive director, ASU Gamage, Stephen Schnepp, president, Broadway Booking Office NYC, and Allan Williams, general manager, Allen Wasser Associates. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. I wonder if we could start off just talking a little bit about the shows that tend to do well on the road. Can you give us sort of some broad characteristics of shows that you think tend to pull in audiences?
I will tell you what has been remarkable for us in Arizona has been obviously from Cats to Phantom to Les Mis to Wicked to Mary Poppins. I mean, I think about the big blockbusters that continue to play and resonate because they have a legacy, a New York legacy, in some cases a West End legacy. I'll turn to my fellow road presenter, Mike.
Yeah, it's, that's actually the question of the business that we all have to answer.
What's going to work?
A year out before we have to present a show, and it's something we spend a lot of time on. I think that what Colleen said is absolutely right. The other thing I think that there's a difference between, and it's subtle, if there's a difference between what a road audience is looking for and what a New York, you cannot discount that when you come to Broadway, it's a community and there's 22 theaters and there's this enormous sense of variety. And within the New York theatrical community, in producing here, there is very much an awareness of form, of being a reason to produce a show. My experience of road audiences is their primary interest is character. It's very much story. They're very much interested in going to this place and experiencing a journey. So that would probably be the only distinction, but I think Colleen
I think the common denominator, though, is that people gravitate towards what's familiar.
Exactly.
And familiar can be defined in a lot of different ways. I mean, the blockbusters are more familiar because they have a higher profile or whatever, but revivals tend to do well because they know the songs. It's familiar to them. That's why there's always a push, or often a push for star casting on the road, because that familiarizes the product a little bit, which is that's a whole other topic.
But I would also say, I'm sorry, Steve, I would also say that we went through a period where I would agree with you, where story was very important, but we also went through a period of spectacle.
Yes.
Chandeliers and helicopters and people
Lion
flying
King
all over. And I really think spectacle for a long time ruled the road.
And Chicago changed all that.
And currently,
Exactly.
Wicked, Jersey Boys, Lion King are still probably the three leaders. Phantom before it ended, and then right behind it, I'd say Mary Poppins and maybe Billy Elliot, because they're multi-weeker. They're playing for multi-weeks.
And Mamma Mia.
And Mamma Mia, of course. Yeah, forgive me.
Well,
That slide.
But that goes, Mamma Mia. But that goes back to what Meredith said about what becomes a classic, because all of those shows you've just named actually have now become classics, because we went through the old South Pacific time and time again with Robert Goulet, and now it's coming back again, but Mamma Mia is a classic on the road.
Interesting, yeah, it's true. I mean, we played most cities 5 or 6 times.
Right.
The other common denominator of all those shows, though, when audiences in New York went to see them and people from out of town came to New York to see them, they walked out and they told their friends, you have to go see this.
Yes.
It had that absolute, not like, oh, it was good, oh, we really liked it. It was, you've got to go.
And that word gets out.
And that word it's the most powerful force.
Well, these are shows that they'll see multiple times.
Right.
They'll see it in New York, then they'll see it in their hometown, which is a strange phenomenon, because then they come back to New York and they'd actually see that show again before they'd see a new title that they're not familiar with.
You were
Les Miserables.
absolutely
It's like they don't want to
Yeah.
take a risk on the unknown. in a
Yeah,
strange
but for that kind of money, that's a lot,
Exactly.
especially in the current economy. That's something that I think that we're all grappling with, is if there's a concern about spending those precious dollars, they're not willing to gamble on something they may not like, and they don't want to experiment with it. We're finding that a lot, unfortunately. And I think that is a sort of a sea change a little bit from maybe where things were 5 years ago.
I think it is, but I also think the whole notion of technology has taken us into another realm, and I want to use High School Musical as that example. my daughter was very young then, and she said, "Mom, I want to see this musical, High School Musical," and it was the television thing. I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Oh, I was on the internet, and they said da 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 da," and that show, from the television version to the stage version, went. By the time it got on the road, there was an enormous young audience there that we hadn't seen before, and it wasn't necessarily because people came to New York and said, "Oh, you have to see it." It was because their children said, "I heard about this."
Right. It had already been distributed.
It had already been
distributed
distributed.
through another media. Yeah.
So actually, that touches on one of my what was going to be one of my questions, which is how important is Broadway to the establishment of a title as a classic? Is it, it's said that people can say direct from Broadway, and that can be handy. Probably both for Steve and Meredith as bookers, sort of selling it to people, and then for presenters and selling it to your audiences.
The presenters still want to go down the street of Broadway and shop for shows that are popular,
Right.
and then in terms of, so they get anchors and they can speak to that, of the big shows, and then there's a question mark about the next shows, and it has to do with price of what's being charged to the presenter, and several other variables too.
You know, it's almost every question that you ask, Gordon, has another side to it. Because I think of Frank Wildhorn, and my community loved Frank Wildhorn. So all three of Frank's shows, whether it was Scarlet Pimpernel, even Civil War, and Jekyll and Hyde, opened in our house, was on the road before it came to Broadway. And we had great success. They knew the music, isn't that right? Is that
Scarlet
right for-
Pimpernel, I don't think.
Maybe not
couple
Scarlet
of them
Pimpernel, but
had-
the other
But
two.
the other two
The other
did.
two
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
And so people were like, "Oh, it's Frank Wildhorn. We're going to go." So
Music is very accessible.
yes.
Yeah, and he has a new one out,
Yes.
Wonderland,
Yes.
coming up.
But you can't, as a presenter, most of us are doing a subscription series where you're doing anywhere, depending on what you are, 4 to 6, or some of the major markets, 8 to 10 shows a year. So part of your responsibility, really to the community, depending on the size, is you have to communicate and talk about range. Not everything is going to be Wicked or Jersey Boys. So in a sense, you have to bring them into the conversation about who these writers are, what place this show is, what it is. You sort of, they don't know what it is. They really don't. So part of your obligation as a presenter is you sort of have to set the table and lay out the expectations for the show before they come in. And it's probably one of the hardest struggles we're all dealing with as a business, because it seems each year less and less information about Broadway is sort of getting out. And it's a constant conversation with all of us about the tools, the technology, things we can do. But to me, it feels harder than it was 5 to 7 years ago in terms of people not knowing. It used to be if you got that plan, the Today Show, and that certain sort of basket of goods you could get for a Broadway show in New York, everybody sort of knew about it.
Because the media is so diversified now, the communication is so diversified.
Well, and newspapers have disappeared. And for many communities across the country, not only are the papers disappearing, but the theater critic is no longer.
Yeah.
So we often struggle with that, and I find as a presenter, we become our own theater critic. For instance, we have a program called the Gamage Ambassadors, and there are 20 of them ranging from age from 9 to 90. We have them see shows, write reviews, post them on our website, and we videotape them talking, and it begins to create a critical theatrical environment where I don't believe that there is one necessarily as it pertains to Broadway in the communities.
That's true. I always make the comparison. People magazine, probably one of the most read magazines in the country. There's at the beginning of that magazine, there's book reviews, there's album reviews, there's a review for every other entertainment medium except
Not the
theater.
That's right.
So it's no wonder people aren't familiar. If the mediums that they're reading aren't covering it.
You're absolutely right, Meredith.
Well, part of the reason is because the theater is presented locally. There's no, like other medium, you can only access it by going to that facility. And when it's at the Gamage in Tempe, it's a radius of audience that that's limited. Everything else, a movie, a book, the distribution is wide immediately. So I guess it's less interest in the media, right?
Yeah, but that is one of the biggest conversations I think we have as an industry right now, is how do we educate the audiences outside of New York? in the Heights, won a Tony Award, and had, got great reviews on the road, wonderful production, struggled a little bit on the because people didn't know what it was.
Same with Light in the Piazza.
Same with Light in the
Nice
Piazza.
light
Like
tour.
the Piazza,
Yeah.
exactly. And also to defend the road, there's sometimes work in Broadway itself, like Passing Strange was one of those musicals I thought this would be great for the road, especially since I'm in a college town, and we just could not make it happen. So I think sometimes the context and providing contextual information about performances is where our biggest work effort is in our communities, and I even think here in New York.
Passing Strange is an example, sorry to interrupt, Michael, that was an example of just not enough. If you were on board, but there weren't enough of you
Right.
all
Right.
to create
what
really the
happened with-
volume of
with-
Right,
tours.
for
What's
something
happened
for
with the
people
play.
to
That's right.
understand. Exactly.
Well, you started to talk about a little bit of the logistics of putting a tour together. Can we talk a bit about the nuts and bolts, and Alan, if you want
Sure.
to start us off?
I mean, for the most part, these tours are franchises of a Broadway show. Sometimes they start on the road, but that's the exception to the rule. So if the show actually has enough success on Broadway, the producer is eager to be able to distribute it across the country, and that's not to make it secondary, but it is the next step, if you will. And they call on the general manager to try to find a way to organize it financially that it can make sense, so that our colleagues, the bookers, Meredith and Steve, could actually sell it to a presenter, which would be the same as Colleen and Michael. And the presenters are the presenters are the customer here. Ultimately, the real customer is the consumer. So, if the popularity isn't there, then they're not going to be able to justify buying it for a certain price, because the show is going to be priced at a certain amount of money. I have an obligation to my client, who's the producer, to be able to make sure enough income is there to make not only what our weekly operating cost is, but enough to actually be able to pay back the startup costs. And that is then the push and pull. If the show is perceived as being wildly popular and that the presenter knows they can sell it, then it's easier for the booker to sell it, and I can demand a higher price. So you are constantly trying to press down the production values in order to make sure that they meet the sort of critical mass of price and demand. And it's really very simple economics, but there's several steps along the way that play into it.
As presenters, we look at the 7 or 8 shows we have in a season, and we look at the most popular show, which tends to be a larger blockbuster, but we also look at, Meredith mentioned the P word, the play. I like to have a play in the season, but economically, we have to balance what that big show is going to be with what a medium show is going to be. And you can't have a season of all big titles. So it's kind of this balancing act that has to happen in addition to that, because
And often
you
the
well know.
balancing act is not just in terms of the economics of the show, but
No,
I
it's-
believe that you all try and come up with
Absolutely.
an assortment
Absolutely.
of a revival, a blockbuster, something a little edgy, perhaps the Tony Award winner, but you don't want to present a season of all revivals or of all plays. You really kind of want to give them a sampling of what's recent in New York.
And it
Both.
becomes tough. Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
Alan.
go ahead.
It becomes tough too when on Broadway there are like shows.
Yeah.
So if you have your, and with no disrespect, a jukebox musical, and then there are several of them, you're like, but I only really want one on the
Right.
season.
Yeah, and then as the producer or as somebody representing the show, it's like, but they're not the same thing.
Right.
But they are of a certain genre, and we do understand the dilemma. But it's an interesting debate.
Going back to what Mike was saying, is that then you have to not only inform the expectations of the audience, but anticipate it at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so
Absolutely.
the truth is that if we knew exactly what the audience wanted,
We'd all be
there
rich.
would be no challenge here, and everyone would be just fine. There would
That's
be
right.
no price differences. Everything would be the same.
But you also get, and this is where, having both presented and produced tours, I honestly, I don't think I really understood this country till I worked on my first tour. And when you go out and you see the theaters and you see how, and it becomes very real, cultural, economic differences all around the country completely impact
Yeah, that's
the
very true.
success of a tour. And the irony is we're all completely interdependent on each other. Which Steve sort of pointed out, if Colleen doesn't book her week and I don't book my weeks and we don't get enough, then there's no tour. So part of what happens every January and February, it's nuts. I mean, we're all
Maybe
calling
March.
each other, and you're sort of going, okay, who's on the coalition of the willing for this one, and can we, you end up calling each other saying, what do you think, and reading each other, and actually a very quite wonderful cooperative way. I mean, it's very interesting how few people actually share a lot of very important information that becomes
Frost
productive.
Nixon is actually a
Well,
perfect
Frost
example of
Nixon
that.
and a great example of that, because it was a fabulous play, and as Meredith knows, it was a play that we really wanted. And part of our responsibility as presenters for Mike and I is we actually call our colleagues and go, come on, this is a great play, come
you
on
don't do
board
it,
with
I
us.
can't do
If
it.
you don't do it,
Yeah.
I can't do it. And often that's how work comes together, because these guys do a great job of lining everything up, but we are interdependent and we do need each other, and sometimes you fall in love with something. Frost Nixon was one of those examples, Spring Awakening was another, and you say, we have to have it. We have to have it.
The downside of that is financial desperation. If in fact those elements can't be put together properly, occasionally they'll come back to myself and the producer and say, the only way this will work is if it costs $20,000 a week less, which means that then the creative staff gets involved, because it means cutting some scenery, cutting some actors, making it more simplified. You still want to maintain the glorious quality of whatever it was you produced originally on Broadway, but you have to make compromises in order to meet the reality of their economic and still preserve the reality of your own.
But yes, that is absolutely true. But what has been very healthy in the last couple of years is actually there's been a lot of great work with creative teams.
Yeah.
And they no longer see it as compromises. And what we've all learned is that why do you open a show in New York? You run out of time and money. And there it is. And then if you're lucky, there it is, right?
Right.
And then you run, and if you're smart, you're going into the theater and you're still learning about your show. And all those lessons then go into the tour and the ramifications of the physical parameters of, if it's a standard tour, closing on a Sunday night, opening the next city on Tuesday, of 6 trucks and that, with the right artists, and they are now, a lot of them really understand this, it helps you create a really wonderful production. The trick is to not look at it as the reduced New York production,
Right.
but its own
Right.
touring
Yes,
production.
bigger
I
is
am
not always better,
so
and-
right.
glad
Yes.
you said that,
Yeah.
because
Right.
the fight we have on the road, particularly as people in my state, there are people coming in and people going out of the state all the time. And they'll say, "Ugh, I don't want to see that. I only like theater in New York." And I wrote, oh, please, yes. Heavens, yes.
years it's
Every
been
yes.
Yeah.
But then I have people who go to Broadway and the West End, and they come back and go, I liked it better at Gamage. It was greater at Gamage. I think it has a different sense. And even producers who have come to Gamage, and we just did Mary Poppins, and Tom Schumacher came, and he went, God, this looks really good in here. I mean, I really think that happens, and it isn't less than. And I'll just say one more thing. The other notion is, while you may have the big star on the road on Broadway, the show may not require that big star on the road. The show itself may be the star. And so you don't, like My Fair Lady, you didn't need an Eliza Doolittle with a name.
What is the sort of standard operating procedure for a tour, and where it goes and how long it stays there, and then how do you negotiate when it's longer and shorter?
Well, the basic is when you call a subscription week tour, which means it's a tour that's going to head out and play each city for only those performances where they've sold tickets in advance. They have subscribers in them. So it's basically depending. Like St. Louis, I do 2 weeks. I have a 2-week subscription series.
We have a 1-week
They have a 1-week
subscription
subscription series. So generally, the show has to close after a Sunday night performance in one city, load up, travel,
And open on a Tuesday.
open up, and a Tuesday night at 8 o'clock.
For an 8-performance week.
Right.
For an
And
April.
most of those, so a guarantee sum is paid from the presenter to the producer, and the producer or general manager like Alan would add up all those monies and say, okay, there's enough of that to pay the initial startup costs, and so we have a tour. Enough to pay in the fee to pay the startup costs, a share of the startup costs, and the weekly operating. And the other tours that are the larger tours that should Jersey Boys be 3 weeks? Should it be 4 weeks? Should it be 5 weeks? Right. Those are almost separate. There's a whole different advisement that we have to, as agents, have to give the producer, and we have to have conversation with the presenters about what they think, how long the show could run in their market. There's a lot more variables to consider on that model.
Right. And in terms of a critical mass of the number of stops a tour needs to make it viable, is there a sort of...
That's changed too.
Is it? Yeah.
Minimum.
Used to be 40 weeks, 35, 40 weeks. Now I'm thinking it's more like 50.
Yeah. If you have to start capitalizing from the first week, if you've had it, some tours I've worked on were capitalized the Broadway, rolled over to London, rolled over to the tour, so it all kind of the money all
right,
flowed.
but it's its own animal.
That's
generally,
right.
yeah.
But if you're starting up from scratch,
but tours are also lasting a little bit longer too. There are frankly more full-week subscription markets than there used to be.
Right.
New performing arts centers have been built, and some markets have gone to longer subscriptions. So, a 60, 65-week tour for a non-blockbuster is kind of almost becoming the norm.
Right.
Which may span 2 seasons.
Yes.
2 calendar years, because
yes.
there are periods of time that aren't practical to present the show.
And sometimes, we wait. I mean, I think that's the other issue, and we're one of the top markets, and so my community expects if a show's opening on Broadway, it's going to be in Tempe, and when I have to say, they're going to do an East Coast swing, and it's not going to happen,
Yeah,
go, well,
a lot of it is
why
just
not?
the logistics.
And it is logistics making that happen. I would also say there's a difference in markets, because we have a 1-week market, but we do, in addition to those 7-8 shows, we also do 4 specials. So we bring out shows that aren't on subscription, that we figure can hold their own, and we do about 4 of those titles, but they could be, Jersey Boys is an example, it could be a 4-week run of that special title. Also, we're a 3,017-seat theater. So when something comes in, Frank Lloyd Wright, God bless his soul, built and designed 3,017 seats in this house. And so a show comes in, and we want to know in the 8 performances that we're going to have fairly decent houses during that time. And
By contrast, a New York Broadway house for musicals is usually 1,150 to 1,800 seats.
I think that's always the shock to producers who haven't been out on the road yet, is the size of the houses out there. And we tell them we're playing the Fox. I mean, how many seats is the Fox? 4,100.
4,100.
The blood drains out of their face. Well, my show's not going to be intimate there, but that's where St. Louis is used to seeing their Broadway shows.
Right.
So
the only place.
and the average Roadhouse is probably about 2,600 seats. That's
it's funny. It's 4,100 seats. It's one of the old movie palaces. There's one in Atlanta, one in Detroit. Extraordinary theater. And I always encourage those artists I know who are like, oh my God, no, hop a plane, come and see this. And it's actually quite moving to them to see their show work in that space for that number of people. I said to Stephen Schwartz, you need to come and stand on the side aisle and watch 4,000 people go out of their minds during Defying Gravity. I mean, it really is quite, and what I find, what works for the space is really the level of the ideas in the writing. If there's a strength in the writing, if there's true conflict in character, it works. It's really quite remarkable.
Can we touch on this a little bit, but can we speak a little bit about plays? I mean, the first shows that were listed in terms of being successful on the road were all musicals, Colleen, and and there have been plays that have toured. Can you tell me about, is there a place for
I definitely
play on
believe it.
I
It is one of
believe there
my
is. I think that
cause
we're taking a
celeb.
pause right now.
Right.
Yeah, it is a cause.
It is a cause celeb.
I've booked a great many plays over the past 15 years, and kind of it was a mission to make sure that one went out every year, because I just think it's important that be part of the overall picture of a series. Not every subscription market is even willing to experiment like that, and some that you wouldn't expect have the same mandate. They want to have a play on their season. But it's become more and more difficult to get them out there. Tony Award winners, Pulitzer Prize winners.
Shows that people even ask about and know about. But, I think one of those things is I want to go back to mission and the commitment of a play coming out. Richard Thomas is a hero. He came out in 12 Angry Men, and there are all these things that, here's John Boy. And so we knew, there was John Boy. Those actors worked our community. they would say, Colleen, we're going to go and talk to this class, or we're going to go and meet with the VFW. How did you get that? Well, we met this guy at lunch, and because he cared so much about that play, and everyone in there, the seminal actors in there, all knew that they had to have a commitment to the community.
That
And
was
it-
one of the
to
most
make that
successful
happen.
touring
Oh, it's
plays.
amazing.
Because it
in
probably
recent
had it
history.
in it.
Yes.
Usually now we have stars on Broadway, big stars, big stars on Broadway doing plays, and then who do we get for the touring
And that's always the
production?
question when the play goes out, well, who's going to be in it?
And I'm going to be a
Well,
little contrarian here.
Okay,
because
do.
I do agree with that, but you can graph the decline of the touring play with the rise of the American regional theater.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
That's where it's going.
when you do
And by that you mean the nonprofit
The Lord,
with
yes.
yeah.
Regional
and
theater.
and so what happened is you have many great local regional theaters, Lord theaters, who are doing fantastic productions, and they sort of took that niche away.
And you're right, actually.
And so that
you
that
get
sort of-
pressure as a presenter
Right.
from
Right.
the local Lord House saying, please don't pick up that production of Red, because if you don't, I
We-
can
we
license
get-
it
we
to
wanna
myself.
produce
We get it
We
all
wanna
the
produce
time.
it, yeah.
We get it all the time.
So
Yeah.
you have that. But also, even if you look at the economics of plays in New York, let's be clear. Maybe Doubt was the last play that ran more than a year. I mean, they're all doing, right now the model is, like you
Right,
said,
right,
16-week
right.
star engagements.
Right.
Right.
And all of these stars who are doing 16 weeks in New York, if we could get them 16 weeks on the road, first of all,
know.
they'd make twice as much money,
Right.
Yeah.
and it would be a love
Right,
fest.
right,
I mean,
right.
part of my, now, I'm heading out here, kids, join me. No, part of my frustration is, Colleen touched on it, there is this whole relationship that you can have with an audience that is a part of your career, that is a part of your life. And you know, when Cherry Jones went out
Right,
in
when
Doubt,
Cherry came out with Doubt.
it was incredibly moving for them. And people, they know that this talent they're seeing is extraordinary. And it is really a remarkable experience. And it's very frustrating to me that an agent will tell their client, sit at home instead of going and taking this
Right.
work. And it's something we talk about
Yeah.
constantly. And so
You almost
I-
wish that they felt
right.
more of a responsibility
Right.
to
Well,
it, because they are the
exactly.
ambassador
They,
of
they
the
are,
brand.
and I think once they do that,
Yeah.
when Billy Crystal did 700 Sundays, and I saw it, and I came and I talked to his agent, I talked to his mentor, and I said, come to Tempe, come to, he goes, no, I'm not doing the road, want to go back to LA. I go, no, come to Tempe. And I think they just got tired of hearing from me. And so he said, okay, I'll do 2 weeks, and then he went off to Australia, and he came and did 2 sold-out weeks. He also played baseball with the ASU baseball team, and I mean, he just did some fun things, but people came and they loved it.
And I did
Right.
August Osage County.
Right. Oh,
I
so
saw it
did
in New
we.
York, and it was one of those things where you just said, you have to do this.
Right, right.
You love the theater. This is great theater. It has to be done. There's no question. I know I'm going to lose money.
Right.
But that's where the
we actually-
equation
But you
went.
stepped up and-
But
yeah.
you step up. And
Right,
no, we
and you
didn't.
do
We did
that.
okay. But
But
you
I-
looked at that set, and you looked at this, and you went, this is such an extraordinary experience. And what that does, and then it goes, is what Colleen talked about relationship to community and to your subscribers. And for the 40% of your subscribers who that satisfies,
Right.
it doesn't just satisfy, they are so grateful. And
Exactly.
they understand. And you have to tend to those people. You have to tend to the Mamma Mia crowd.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's
And there's a lot
Yeah,
of tending.
yeah.
But I think it is about risk, and whether it's the play or so I like to say, our communities trust us enough to take the risk. But we also, and I don't know what you do, Mike, or not, but we also allow people to opt out.
yeah.
Because I have to say everything isn't for everyone. So when we do something risky where there's full frontal
content
nudity,
issues or,
content, whatever, we say to the community ahead of time, this is a fabulous work. We absolutely love it. This is what this work is about. We hold discussions. Tom Hulse came out, we did Spring Awakening, and we held an open house in the theater, and we had a panel of parents and clergy and teachers to ask questions. And finally someone stood up and said, okay, exactly what part might I be offended by? I mean, I want to know exactly what is that, if it's the moment or if it's, the nude scene. And so once we said it, and they went, that's not so bad. And there were people who actually had said, no, I don't want that on the subscription. And then they went back and bought tickets because they they had to say it. They learned.
Yeah.
They learned. Al, that's a good word.
Your dedication to your community is really admirable. because I mean, I'm sure that when you hear the price of a play like August Osage County, and you decide, all right, I'm going to present it, you must take a swallow deeply, because the risk of it means
it's
that
a
you
big
have
show.
to make sure you're going to find a way to pay for it through the rest of the season.
But I use, shocking, but I use a sports metaphor. You know, I know. Brace yourselves.
Okay, here we go.
No. You see, I live in St. Louis, and there's this extraordinary loyalty to the Cardinals. It's a part of the fiber of their being. And they'll go, and the team loses.
Yeah,
But they don't
it's
care.
charming.
But they
though.
don't care, because this experience means something to them. And what the factor they're looking at is the team really trying? Are they really
Right.
playing the game?
Right.
Do they love the game? So when you do something like August, or something where it's not my taste, but if they realize, well,
I applaud you for trying.
that's kind of amazing, not my thing, but wow, then you're fine.
Right.
It's only when you do something that it's either poor quality and they
Right.
know it when they see it,
Exactly.
or something that's just really, they can't quite figure out why this would be done.
Yeah, you're
Exactly.
spoon feeding him something cheap.
That's
Exactly.
when you get into trouble.
Exactly.
Mike, I think it was you who mentioned really getting to know the differences in the country and the country's audiences and things like that. Can we talk a little bit about what some of those differences are and what kinds of content? I mean, you mentioned Spring Awakening as being risky. What sort of content are you more hesitant, or do you feel needs more education to sort of book on?
You
the
know,
road?
and I'm so happy Alan said learn, because it is about contextualizing the work, but if there is nudity, it needs a little more work. If there is any attack on any religious group in our community, it needs advanced work. And
Language.
Language. And then you get I know you get this question all the time, can I bring my 9-year-old? You know, and it doesn't
Depends on
really,
your
can I bring it? And right, and I have to
9-year-old.
say, I am a mother. You know, you're talking to my 6-year-old who, you know, saw Tommy, you know, when she was 3 and saw this and that. But I think that's like one of those guides that we have to put out there. It's not that we don't do the work, we won't do the work, we are not receptive. It is that we have to prepare and say these things are going to happen. And I have, God bless my audience, I sit next to a couple of real old season holders, and they said, we're so glad you told us that, because we don't want to hurt your feelings, but we didn't want to see it. I said, no, that's great. That means you're getting the information, you're understanding the information, and you're choosing what's right for you. At the same time, someone sitting next to me said, I wasn't sure, but I went and I loved it.
Yeah.
So it's just communication.
It's also interesting. Sometimes we misjudge what they're going to be sensitive to, and we get we become hyper cautious. I remember when Rent first went out, and that was, of course, it was groundbreaking in many ways. But there was a big sensitivity on the road. There's subject matter there that our demographic of subscribers are going to object to. So there was disclaimers, and there was you really don't have. You could opt out, and I don't believe. I mean, the amount of bounce back from audiences saying, "I can't believe you brought this to our town." It was so minimal that I think we all learned a lot from that show.
I think
but
you're
going
right,
forward, we
Meredith.
still, I mean, Avenue Q, we were like, "Oh, there's puppets having sex." So really, we need to make sure that people are okay with that. Well, you know what? When it's puppets, it's kind of okay. So it's amazing that we do tend to still be. The knee-jerk reaction is they're not going to like this. Well, give them a chance,
Hair just opened at the Kennedy Center, is doing great business, and we have some educational blurbs that we put in materials, and that's just about.
We have hair in December.
I know,
and I have
exactly.
to say, what's happening and what you've said, Meredith, is there's, again, going back to Alan's word, a learning process. So Rent was like, oh, and then it was like Avenue, and then it was like Spring Awakening. Now we get to hearing people like, oh, hair. Oh, they're just going to
they're
take
just
the
naked.
clothes off during that scene. And so
again?
an audience becomes more and more sophisticated
Yes.
as it goes on.
Is there a difference in demographic in terms of who goes to, like in terms of age or anything else, in terms of who goes to Broadway and who goes to? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Oh, yes. I would say it is the least diversified audience. I mean, I think we work really hard and to have people there, but I can go
Colleen
into
and I
a
are the
theater.
demographic of the people who buy the tickets.
We're women, predominantly white, unless you've seen like when Sean John did
Raisin in the Sun.
in the Sun, or when Denzel was on stage. You see the houses here in New York drastically change, and the same thing on the road. But I think that's where our greatest work is. I don't know, Mike.
Yeah, no, it's an island, I mean, it remains. So I mean, everyone's working very hard on it. A lot of it is the relationship to the show. I mean, it's interesting when you look at that tradition of why audience grew up going to musicals, there's still a strong cultural base for it. And also, you know, musicals still, for the most part, remain about the past. The music is about the past, the experience, which is, you know, it just is. It's kind of its beauty. I mean, and what's actually coming around right now is with the combination of Glee, which is, I mean, basically,
Love that show.
but
So
basically,
grateful
if
for
you
that.
look at what he's doing there, he's stealing the MGM playbook. He used to do all those. They used to do all those anthology musicals.
Yep.
Get the stars out there, do the songs you know. I mean,
Right.
you know, so
Absolutely.
there's sort of that thing. And what's interesting about that experience of the past is that if you look at what's happened in the rest of the culture of everybody being in a place where you can now, if you want, you can only look, read, and see those things that you know. When you go to the theater, and this is, I think, our fundamental challenge, you know you're going to be sitting next to people you may not know. You're not sure of what it is, and there's that. But when it is something that you all think you understand, that it's a part of your lives, that's a very, very important sort of cultural connector, which that's like the genius of the Mary Poppins.
Right.
You have the grandparents bringing the grandkids to something that I cherish. You share it with them, and then it's this extraordinary theatrical event. And you feel that audience sort of just becoming one with it. And the irony is it's sort of come around as a really popular sort of force in terms of what I know there I'm going to feel something in common with people.
I think also when people come to the theater, they do want to see themselves. And a case in point of what's become a classic, Mamma Mia. So it happens again and again, and there's a lot of women there. Well, we had, I don't know, probably our 5th tour, and the young man that was cast as the fiancé was African American. And so the show's going on, and people know and love the show, and then he walks out, and I know I heard this collective, and then it was like, oh, yeah, okay, he's the fiancé, and back into the show. And I think as much of that kind of casting that we can do, irrespective of the time period of the story, it says there's a place in it for me. I get to see me on that stage. And I think that's something that starts at the creative level. I think it's something we need to ask more of seeing. I remember Audra McDonald when she was auditioning for Beauty and the Beast, and she said, I couldn't get hired as a spoon. I mean, it was in the New York Times Magazine. I was like, oh my God, first of all, she's gorgeous and she sings beautiful. And she couldn't
Too pretty to
because
be a
that
spoon.
entire show
Definitely
opened.
fork type.
It was an all-white cast that opened it. You know, so I think those kinds of, you know, things.
It is true that people want to see themselves on stage, which I think explains the popularity of a show like Rock of Ages right now.
Or
Because
August Osage County.
Yes,
people who-
Or Jersey Boys, for God's
Or
sake.
Jersey Boys.
Guys love to come to Jersey Boys.
Exactly.
people who lived through the 80s are now starting to reminisce about it. That wasn't exactly the most attractive cultural period of our lives, but that is what we have to look forward to, is a recreation of that period now.
But I do think you begin to bring a culture of behavior. I brought my daughter to see Jersey Boys, and it's like, what does she know about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons? And she was like, this is great music. I'm going to get this on my iPod, you know? And I do think that bringing your child, schools, you know, God bless the schools, they have the hardest time in the world. But when I lived on Long Island for a short period of time, we always came into town. We saw Leonard Bernstein conduct, we came to see that, we blah, blah, blah. That doesn't happen anymore. And we as presenters, for Mike and I, we actually have to pick that up.
Right.
We actually bring the Girl Scouts. We, you know, go out and actively recruit those young people, because I think there's a generation that didn't, whose parents were not able to afford it or what have you, to come.
Yeah, the greatest long-term investment in Broadway would be the return of arts education to the schools,
You
no
bet.
question about it.
Which is again why we're also grateful for Glee, because at least it's on some level it's making being a part of the theater cool again.
Right.
It doesn't eliminate what Colleen started with, though, that we are very undiversified. I mean, each show has a little tangent it reaches out to, maybe a different age group slightly, maybe a different race, maybe a different religion slightly, but it is, when you go to the theater on Broadway or probably on the road, you're sitting with theater goers.
Yeah.
You're not sitting with people who generally it's their first time in the theater, because people who go to the theater are people who go to the theater. It sounds a little silly, but it's hard for people who don't go to the theater to to acclimate to that experience.
That's what
It's a
the
big leap.
Blockbusters,
Absolutely.
really helped change that
Yes.
because
They
you
bring
know,
those
Phantom of the
numbers. Brings in the new
Opera
people, yeah.
was the first one that played 4 weeks minimum in every market, and people that if it's a 1 week subscription series, there's 3 more weeks of inventory that allow people that don't regularly go to come. Yeah, exactly.
To come. And I think economically, I think Meredith touched on the economy of all of this. What we've now discovered is there are people who are theater goers who said, look, I want to remain a theater goer, but
There's
I
only
don't think I
time-
can
so
do
many
that.
times I can go,
So
yeah.
we've gone to full subscription and mini subscriptions, and our minis have quadrupled. It does 2 things. It brings in the theater goers, but it brings in those individuals who said, you know, I went to see Jersey Boys and I kind of liked it, so I'll try 3 or 4, as opposed to you have all or you have nothing, because then you have a community that you sit with. Just like, I'll use a sports analogy, when we go and see the Phoenix Suns play, you have your season seats and that becomes your little
Right.
neighborhood. And that's what we find with ours. And I think that's one of the ways to bring people into the theaters, to be able to do that.
One thing we haven't talked about, sometimes there are productions that, as I understand it, do fairly well on the road but never do come into New York for whatever reason. How often is that viable? When does that happen, I guess is the question.
It's not. The last one I remember that had a full tour before coming into New York was Jekyll and Hyde,
Yeah,
I think.
That's right.
Well, Mamma Mia did a
I
lot.
did, but
Mamma
when it was
Mia- no, actually,
London,
Mamma
but
Mia's a
London
big-
was big, big,
Yes.
big,
London
big,
was
big.
big, and then
Right.
Toronto
Yeah.
sat for,
Right.
That's right.
yeah, but it's still, but yes, it played
Well-
the major markets before it came into New
Well,
York.
you know what, Barry
Can you ever
Weissler-
not come into New York, I guess is my question?
Well, yeah, there are some shows that Happy Days never came into New York.
Doolittle, did that tour? Dr. Doolittle?
Dr. Doolittle never came in. I don't think it
Never
was ever
came in.
planned to come in.
I mean, yeah, you can.
I'm producing Bring It On, and actually, our deliberate strategy with that show is to tour for a period of time, and then come into New York. I mean, Barry Weissler used to do it all the time. In fact, most of
Right.
his shows were that way.
What's the thinking? You mentioned that's a deliberate strategy. What's
Well, you know, part of it is, and this is where the producer hat comes in. Particularly when and we have this amazing creative team, but one of the frustrations for all of us, part of the creative community, is people need time to learn their craft. They need time to get the show right. And 4 weeks out of town for some of these major musicals, it's just not enough time anymore. And so part of this is we're doing a regional, and then we're going to tour, and then hopefully, if everything goes okay, come into New York. So part of it is giving them everything to get the show the best it can be. The other thing is that when you're doing shows that are designed to be entertainments, you can look at the track record in New York, and sometimes it's a hostile environment around here. And we have this extraordinary music, and I know that audiences are going to flip for the score. So I know as a producer, and David Merrick did it on Oliver.
But you can't do that with every title.
You can't do it with every
No.
title.
Yeah.
It's
No.
specific.
Very
You're
specific.
right about the hostile environment, because now that you mentioned it with Mamma Mia was actually never contemplated to come in.
Right.
It was a big hit. They just expected it to be a hit on the road and in Middle America, but they knew that the critics would, have a gun pointed at them. And it was ironic in terms of the timing when Mamma Mia came in, because it came in right after September 11th. And I remember the Times, everybody 6 months prior would have said they're going to slaughter this show. The Times went, you know what, this is
What we need.
This is exactly what we
Good
need right now.
time
It's
for
a
it.
Twinkie, and it tastes good, and it feels
we
good,
do.
and this is just
Yeah.
what we need.
Yeah.
So some of it is just timing.
But generally, I would say most shows want to play New York.
Right.
To establish
Yes,
their brand.
yes, to establish the brand, because then you go back to an earlier question you asked: is do you need that good housekeeping seal of approval of the Broadway brand in order to tour? And in most cases, you actually do.
You
Right.
probably could have toured Mary Poppins
Right.
before
Yes,
it came to
because
Broadway,
it's familiar. They
because
didn't-
Right.
yeah, it
everybody
wasn't
wants to
contingent
see
on-
that,
the
I
title.
presume, right?
And I
And Bring It
think-
On would work because of the familiarity,
Oh,
Yes.
familiarity
Yeah,
of the
but
title.
it
and-
also ties into, and this is where working, Andy Blankenbuehler's director and choreographer, amazing. But part of it ties into the earlier conversation of working with them, saying, we don't expect it to tour as a blockbuster without this sort of branding. So here are the economics of this tour to make it make sense. And that reality has been on the table for Andy and David Corrins and Andrea, the designers, as we've created the whole show. So that mentality and understanding, and Jake Bell, who's an extraordinary production guy, worked on many tours, has been in the room with them saying, well, if you want to do this moment, here's the impact on the trucks, and here's that. So there's a whole craft there that, what's interesting is that it used to be really prior to the Cameron Revolution, there were Broadway producers And there were road
That's
producers.
terrific.
And the Broadway producers handed over the show to the road producers because they understood this is a different craft, this is a different form to get right. And so now there's sort of an understanding, but there are producers who have really made their, by working with New York producers and doing their road translation, as it were.
Right.
So the artist doesn't have just a blank canvas. It's already inside a frame.
Right.
They can only paint out to the edges, in other words. I mean, it seems like, a simplified way of doing it, but they've got parameters they have to work within, which actually I think frees them to do the job properly or to
does.
their own satisfaction.
And I think that's a wonderful concept because I spend a lot of time in New York and in London and seeing work and then seeing if it's out of town. And a lot of times I watch work and go, I wonder how much of that is actually going to get on a truck.
Yeah.
And what is that really going to look like when it comes to my house? And that's one of the things that I have to be very concerned about. So I have to say, okay, when someone says, well, we've handed it over to a road producer, okay, what happened to it? And if I don't have the opportunity to see it beforehand, I almost never present anything unless I've seen it. Never.
You want to know that it hasn't
Never.
been compromised, it's
Right,
been customized.
right.
To go back to
Right,
where we
right,
started at the
right,
beginning.
right. Good,
Most of the
good,
road
good.
producers, though, now that work a lot, have really mastered
Yeah.
that craft.
Yes, yes,
Have really
yes.
mastered
Well-
it and work in partnership with the Broadway producer.
And they know.
And it's usually a co-production in some
Right,
way
right.
to help it move quicker,
Right.
make cuts that are that are not noticeable.
No,
Yeah.
I completely agree, but I think there is a vigilance that we still have to do. My very first show, which will remain nameless, 19 years ago when I came to Gamage, I went and watched it and I went, I am really angry. I'm upset with the show. I think the actors are phoning it
You'll
in.
tell us later.
And so, no, it will remain secret. And I went backstage and I was looking for the production stage manager and they had the call board. And there was a note on the call board that said, we really have to gear it up because for our next performance, because we're going to, and I won't even name the next theater, and that's a really important theater town. Oh, I was furious. I called the producer and said, get on a plane and get here if you ever hope to work here again, ever. And that person did do it. But even when a show comes in, on that opening night, I am sitting there going, okay, it's good, okay.
I'm so happy
Mrs.
I wasn't
Happy.
at the other end of that.
Yeah, and I was like, ooh, and I'm still mad. But I did want to say one other thing about diversity, because I think we glossed over it a bit. One of the other issues at play is the industry itself. And our industry is not very diverse.
Right.
And whether it's our booking agents, presenters, producers, it's not very diverse. And until we make strides there, I don't think we're going to see the diversity in our audiences.
The creation.
Because people are not at the creative table, they're not at any part of this industry. And that behooves us to do as much mentoring and bringing young people along.
Do you feel like steps are beginning to be made with shows like In the Heights or maybe the Color Purple tour? Or?
Yeah, I think so. And I again, it goes back to what is Broadway, and I think that definition and title is shifting and changing. But I think there needs to be more people of color who are producers. There needs to be more people of color who are presenters, who are booking agents, so that the industry. So diversity doesn't have to be thought of as a one-off. That it's integrated into the industry. And we're just not there.
Producers have a tendency to produce things that entertain them.
Right.
So it comes
right,
from
and
their
you
own
should.
taste.
Right.
Those are the shows that generally work, are the ones that actually please the person who's behind creating it. And so she's right, it has to be a fundamental shift in the people who are participating in the process. Otherwise, we can't just say we're going to diversify our audience, we have to diversify the product, probably. And you're right, things like In the Heights do help, but it reaches out just tangentially to a little bit of a different audience.
Can you ever find shows from off-Broadway? Does that ever happen?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Nonsense. We did a tour of
Yes,
Nonsense.
Nonsense. Stomp is a big
Blue
one.
Man Group
Blue
is
Man
out
Group
right now
is out.
Doing big
business.
numbers, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But they're usually
Altar
special
Boys,
events, though.
that's right.
They are.
It's usually like a
That's
stomp or a Blue
Yeah,
Man Group.
yeah.
I don't recall there being an off-Broadway musical or play
Yes,
that's
I don't think so.
toured recently.
Altar Boys, did it tour?
They
Oh,
did.
yes,
Yeah.
Altar
Right.
Boys
Yeah.
Boys
Yeah.
toured and
It's
did
unique
well.
because the off-Broadway economic is a difficult one to work in, so it's hard to create a show in that genre. But yeah, it does exist. And it actually helps because often they're alternative type entertainments which help diversify your
Diversify
product,
the-
right?
Right, exactly.
But it also points to some of the challenge because as a presenter, what's happened in Broadway communities, as you pointed out, off-Broadway it's gone. So as a producer, you might as well spend the extra $1 million and do it on Broadway and roll the dice. So you have so you have a lot that's what that's Bloody Buddy Andrew Jackson. That's I'm sorry, what was the show you mentioned that came from the public?
Oh,
Passing Strange.
Passing Strange. I'm sorry, Passing
That's
Strange.
that show.
right.
And
Yeah.
those are hard to present for us right now because the audiences aren't used to that
Scottsboro
vocabulary.
Boys.
Scottsboro Boys, the same thing. And so part of you as this presenter, you're sort of having to sort of guide them into, okay, here's our off-Broadway niche show,
Right.
and begin that conversation with them.
Those shows that he just mentioned a generation ago would have been produced off-Broadway.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
How soon do you begin thinking about a national tour for a show that hits?
As soon as
As soon as
possible.
they get a call from the booking agent.
Sooner than it used to be. Often, producers are interviewing booking agents before the shows even come into New York. More often than not, in fact. The touring life of a Broadway show, that's often where a lot of the money is. So, I mean, I don't think anybody anymore comes in with the expectation, well, I'll just do Broadway, maybe I'll do the road. I mean, it's kind of a package deal, or you hope it to be.
You plan for success, and success includes a distribution beyond New York.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, it isn't crucial to hire the booking agent before you've done your Broadway show, but you want,
I agree.
but you want to be prepared
Writing it.
for whatever it
The
is.
first song is written. When the first note starts with C. We're going to start the show with the letters with the note C. Little Z.
Begin in California.
Exactly.
As a presenter, because again, it's a small business and we all talk way too much. I mean, you're reading scripts. You basically know, as the New York community knows, you know what's going to be on Broadway for the next 18 months. And one of the things that's probably not known is a lot of presenters invest in Broadway.
That's right.
It's a big sort of angel pool for Broadway producers. So you're pretty much tracking everything 18 to 24 months out. And the smart producers are also planting seeds and letting everybody know this is what I'm working on. There's just sort of a real conversation that goes on all the time.
And we are often invited to workshops. I remember Little House on the Prairie, and actually Patrick Swayze was in that workshop with Melissa, and saying, what do you think? I mean, and you mentioned the Weislers. We actually had a conversation where they said, what would you like to see?
Right.
Not like, what do you think? What would you like to see?
Right.
And, because the road has an import, both in the economics of a show, but also in the life of New York. I mean, it is a symbiotic relationship. It isn't a top-down relationship where I think it might have been at the beginning stages of the road. It's like this, and making that happen.
Is it a challenge to make some people understand that, or to get some people to understand that, or has that improved over the years?
I
or
think it's
it
a
is-
given.
okay.
I
Oh,
think
yeah.
it's a given.
Absolutely.
We are economic partners
We're
now.
all in it together.
Yep,
If you don't
we are.
understand it, you're not actually participating, or you
Although
won't be for
you
long.
do get a lot of, you get these two, I get a lot of calls like, what will America think about
Right.
Mr.
America.
Well, as the spokesman for America, I'll tell you, you sort of go,
Right.
well,
Right. I got a
but-
call once to come up to Toronto to see a show, which will remain nameless, and they go, well, what do you think about the show? And I said, well, these are the things that I don't think will really work. And they went, okay. And then I was down in New York doing something, and the company that was going to work with this company, they said, well, we're going to bring it down. They go, well, did you make those changes Colleen talked to you about? And I went, oh, really? We're supposed to do something with that information? But I think people really want to know will the road, find, and not just Tempe, Arizona, but will the rest of the country think this is a good thing or not a good thing? Or
Roadworthy is the-
is it
yeah.
roadworthy? That's a good example.
Is Remain
Roadworthy.
Nameless a musical or play?
Remain nameless. Remain, no,
We
no,
were talking about
different
that show
show.
twice?
Yeah,
Twice.
no,
We'll get it out of here.
I
And do they have a booking agent?
see nothing. It is a small business.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
when we saw each other today, and Gail was saying, "Oh yeah, well let me," and we were like, "Hey, how you doing? How you doing?" There wasn't a like, "Who are you?" Everyone knows everyone.
How many
Good thing
markets
that-
are there around the country? Is there a...
Ooh,
Well,
Meredith?
we're talking full subscription weeks or more. 60?
60, and then you take a show, the one that I'm proud of in terms of the number of cities. Les Miserables went to 175 markets. So that was really expanding it. It played a
Beyond the full week
Beyond the
market.
full week. No, but they played full weeks in every single one of those.
Wow.
So
Right,
Sioux
that-
City,
yes, yes.
South Dakota,
Right.
played a full week.
Wow.
So it really expanded it. But I would say about, Meredith said 65.
Well, to that point, I mean, I alluded to it earlier, but I mean, the impact of those Cameron Macintosh shows in the early 90s fundamentally changed touring Broadway because it allowed a lot of cities to begin building their subscription series because those shows were so popular and everybody had to have tickets that they bought the tickets for the other shows, so they began to get the whole sense of the whole experience.
Yeah, so what used to be, that's why the road has gotten, the tours have gotten longer, is because what used to be a split week market,
Right.
some of these shows have cultivated and that they've developed into full week
Full
markets
week
over
markets.
time.
Lubbock, Texas rented the theater in Lubbock, Texas for Les Miserables, and then the presenter,
Right.
a presenter who was not working in the market came in and decided to do a series there because it was a big hit. So it kind of helps expand them.
And in many
Audiences.
markets, sometimes you have more than one theater doing Broadway, or you have an independent producer coming in doing road work. So I think there are a wide range of people. There's a whole presenting market in colleges and universities, and if there is a particular work, that work may actually have a life out on college and university campus that traditionally would not be doing Broadway. The play, the play, the play. The play.
And on that note, that might actually be time for us to wrap it up.
Oh.
They're giving me that.
the
They're
thing.
giving me that. Yeah.
Don't forget the musical.
Also,
No, we love musicals.
And the Blockbusters.
all right. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for joining us. These programs are brought to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in partnership with our friends at CUNY TV. On behalf of the American Theater Wing, I'm Gordon Cox, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Working in the Theater.
I'm Ted Chapin, chairman of the American Theater Wing. The Wing has played a vital role in New York's theatrical life for more than 60 years. Best known for creating the Tony Awards, we stand for excellence, but we also support education in the theater, and our work reaches beyond Broadway in New York. The Working in the Theater television programs, which are supported by the Annenberg Foundation and the Dorothy Strelsin Foundation, are unequaled forums for discussions with today's most creative artists. Downstage Center's in-depth radio interviews were created in conjunction with XM Satellite Radio and can be heard on our website. For people who are starting their careers, we have a 2-week boot camp for aspiring actors from colleges across the country called Springboard NYC. And our theater intern group provides a forum for young people who are starting their careers to build a professional network. All of the American Theater Wing's educational and media programs are available for free on demand from our website, americantheaterwing.org. Thanks for your interest in the Wing, and thanks for watching.